From the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa, this is Switchyard, a podcast for people hungry for eye-opening essays, moving fiction, soul-stirring poetry, and honest, thought-provoking conversation. I'm Ted Genoways, editor of Switchyard magazine, and your host. Join me and our lineup of literary all-stars as we think through and hash out our world's difficult and fascinating challenges. It happens every 4 years. The national media, which is increasingly urban and coastal, descends on the middle of the country in a pitched last-minute bid to understand the mind of the rural voter. I've lived in so-called red states, states with histories of voting for Republican candidates, for most of my adult life. So I've seen this frustrating cycle repeat and repeat. The media rushes in, unprepared and lacking context, and despite the good faith efforts of quality reporters, rural America is once again oversimplified and reduced to a set of easy cliches. With that in mind, and as a kind of corrective, I assembled the summer 2024 issue of Switchyard magazine and hosted a series of accompanying talks at the Switchyard Festival in Tulsa last May. My hope is that our contributors present a richer, more complex version of rural America, or rather, multiple rural Americas. Inevitably, many of the topics are serious, but the discussions are lively, funny, searching, and driven by hope. In this live audience episode, I talk with two remarkable voices from rural America, New York Times best-selling author and Switchyard contributor Jeff Sharlet, and acclaimed climate activist and political organizer Jane Kleeb. From the deep-rooted divisions fueling hate and violence to the beacon of hope emanating from rural America, Sharlet and Kleeb delve into the heart of our complex political landscape and explore the power of community as we navigate through uncertain times together. Their discussion reveals the roots of the anger and despair felt in rural America, but also how ordinary citizens are becoming catalysts for change, forging a path toward unity and cooperation in the face of adversity. I wanted to start by saying that this pairing is interesting enough that Jeff initially was like, I don't know what we're supposed to do. How is this going to work? And I tried to reassure Jeff that this was going to work just fine because I would simply ask questions and then the two of them would just have to answer them. But exactly as I suspected, yesterday, I don't know if you were on the plane at the time or on a layover, that I got an email from Jeff saying, I've read the issue of the magazine. I get it now. It's all going to be fine. And indeed it will. What Jeff and Jane are best known for, aside from all of their various other bona fides, Jeff is the author of a book called The Undertow, which, well, the subtitle alludes to the slow civil war, to this dividing of the country along political lines. Jane is a political organizer and has worked on a number of progressive issues that have to do with trying to organize people in rural areas in many of the strongholds that Jeff has also written about. So I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about the challenges and, to my mind, the narratives that we're trying to change, trying to understand how to tell a different story about who we are as a country and what those rural areas may mean to the future of that country. Just as we were upstairs, Jeff started into a partial answer of what that question would be. So I tried to whisk them downstairs as quickly as possible to make sure that that conversation happened on stage and not up there. But where I wanted to start from on exactly this point for each of you, on Thursday night, we were lucky to have Bill McKibben here, and we talked a great deal about a piece that he published in Mother Jones and then a follow-up companion piece that's in this new issue of Switchyard, where Bill talks about the fact that so much of the environmental movement and the conservation movement originates from this instinct to say no to things, to say no to dams, to say no to pipeline projects. But he said that we've reached the point in the larger climate battle where we have to find things to say yes to that we've got to start turning toward this question of not just what we're blocking and what we're opposing, but what we're trying to build in its place. And it strikes me that it's not just the climate discussion where that's the case, but it's the larger political discussion of what do we say yes to? We've spent, especially on the progressive side, years saying no to Trump policies and Trumpism more broadly. But what do we say yes to? What do we build in its place? How do we start to build a new ethic and aesthetic for the future? Jane, I'm going to let you start because I know you have an answer.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. I think a couple things. One, it's almost like we have to do both of these things at the same time because there still exists risky projects that are in rural communities that we do have to stop in order to protect folks' property rights, the sovereign rights of tribes, our land, and our water. But one of the problems that we're facing in rural America right now is the climate movement and the progressive larger community has for years been saying, we need to be 100% clean energy without doing any organizing in the communities that have the land in order to build the wind and solar. So what you're seeing now is this major backlash in rural communities because they feel like, yet again, here comes urban interests telling us what to do with our land and our communities, and it's happening to us rather than with us. And you could be doom and gloom about that and cite all the statistics about how 30 to 40% of the renewable energy projects right now in America are being blocked by rural zoning and essentially aren't getting built. Or we can see this as a real opportunity to show America that actually rural America can lead America's next 100 years of energy production, just the way that we have a tremendous amount of pride of feeding not only America, but feeding the world, that we can also have that same amount of pride empowering America, empowering the world. But that's not going to be done to us. We actually have to now be engaged in the conversation about land use, about how is more of the money from these energy projects staying in our community? What does it look like for a rural community to come together and say, we want $500,000 a year to help fund a daycare center or a mental health facility for our community? And one of the biggest problems that I think we're facing right now is rural and urban don't see a shared destiny anymore. There is no shared vision of how are we building America together. It's very isolated. Rural people thinking that they're forgotten and left behind, and urban people thinking that rural folks are a bunch of redneck racists, so I don't want anything to do with them. So I do think that projects like clean energy, doing things like expanding public education from pre-K all the way to community college, these are things that we can start using as visioning exercises for America, because I spend a lot of time in rural communities, both in Black and brown rural communities and white communities and tribal rural communities. And they all want to stop the hate conversation that's happening. It is depressing, and they want leaders who are actually coming to them saying, how are we building an America together? So I think that's one thing, is we have to actually start really providing some concrete things that we're doing together, and that it's the shared destiny moving forward.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. And I should say that the reason I was at first confused, because I'm not a political organizer. My writing engages politics, but I have no solutions. I very early on had an editor, my first big magazine story, and it was about this group called the Family or the Fellowship that had a lot of influence in Washington. And I said, but I don't know what to do about it. And he says, that's okay, because there's smart people like Jane. There is this division of labor, I think, in the world and storytelling. And I'm starting to think that the commonality is we are at this moment of inflection where the old forms of organizing, the old forms of storytelling are inadequate, insufficient to meet this moment. And that can lead to this sense of crisis, which I think is a flattening term. Crisis, it's a binary. Will we live or will we die? But as you're saying, next 100 years of rural life, we're going to live, and we have to then make choices about how to do that. I think in that context and about that rural-urban divide, I'm thinking about a militia leader I met in Marinette, Wisconsin, where I was roaming around for a chapter of this book, The Undertow. And really, actually, I wasn't trying to get in trouble. I was taking photographs of the flags people fly. And he, in Marinette, Wisconsin, had his window covered with a flag that said, "Fuck Trudeau." And I thought, well, that's weirdly international thinking for that kind of guy. And I stopped to take a picture, and I ended up in the strange thing. It turns out I had, just by standing in front of their house, violated several security perimeters. His wife comes out, but there's common ground. Don't worry. She says, "My husband's a photographer too. And he's also got a Glock on his hip." And he says, "Would you like to come in and would you like this flag?" So you say yes. And he had no illusions about who I was. He says, either you're a Fed, in which case I don't shoot yet, or you're an intruder, in which case you're not leaving this house, or you're a fool. And I got it for the podcast. I am the fool. And we talked a long time. And this guy, he had been at January 6th. And the reason he was expecting the feds is you go into his house, it's a pool table covered with ammunition, long guns, night vision, the kind of body armor that the police don't wear because it's too heavy, that will stop a 9mm all day long. This man was prepared. He was part of a militia. He exaggerated at 7,000, but it was real. It was real there. His kids are running around, all trained on guns from a long time. There's the "Don't Tread on Me" flag, the all-black American flag, which means no quarter in the coming Civil War. And in the corner, a screen of his video. He was a photographer. I think he'd been an Associated Press photographer at one time in his distant past, of January 6th, to which he had attended. And yes, of course he'd been carrying with their guns at January 6th. Or, as he put it in these racialized terms, let's just say I didn't get mugged on the way out, which was his imagination of the city. But there was this fascinating thing as well, because looping with the January 6th footage, and this is something that maybe goes back, is the pipeline, Standing Rock, which he had been very invested in as well. And he had been there a lot. His two great video works were documenting the revolution on January 6th and the great courage of Standing Rock. Now, this is not to let this guy off a hook. He's well armed and dangerous and everything else, and deluded. He says there's a rural city divide. And I said, well, Rob, you live in a small city, so what side are you on? And he goes, well, I keep some land in the country so that he can go fight over there against his own neighbors. But there's a no to that guy that can be heard. There's also, and I think of this, look, the great wisdom of improv comedy, where one person sets up a joke. You don't say no. You always have to say yes and. Yes and. Look at your concern about the pipeline. And that and can be sharp. I'm not saying, oh, hey, really, Rob and I are all along. After the book came out, I thought he would anyway, I will not be welcome in Marinette, Wisconsin again. I thought he would understand, hey, we're talking across a big divide. But that yes and I think that's a storytelling yes and, but I think there's also a political organizing yes and if misused, it can be really insulting to the people who have been hurt. And I don't think everyone is responsible for the yes and, but those of us in a position to offer that and extend that, that's the critical work right now, I think.
Well, and what strikes me as being so similar in the work that each of you have done is that it is fundamentally boots on the ground kind of work, that it is rooted in a granular and particular knowledge of a place and not trying to generalize and not trying to create master narratives that then are reinforced, but to actually go to these places and try to understand what's going on there. It may be simply to document it. It may be to try to understand it well enough to serve that community or to mobilize that community. But it starts with getting a particular knowledge that is local and that is complex. Jeff, you look like you were ready to jump in.
Oh, I'm just agreeing.
Well, I like it anytime that people agree with me.
I mean, well, I'll say this in terms of two Nebraskans, because I write about Nebraska as well. In Omaha, Nebraska, and maybe there's a yes and to this as well. The long title of the book is following the ghost of Ashley Babbitt, the insurrectionist who was killed on January 6th as she was trying to attack members of Congress and has since become a martyr of that right-wing movement. So I was driving around the country, not with any particular January 6th plans, but it wasn't hard to find. And I came into Omaha, and there's a church there, Lord of Hosts Church, Pastor Hank Kuhneman, who has now become one of these small regional Christian nationalist warlords. And I do mean warlord. He has also a militia, churches with militias. And this was this church that they then had fully armored gunmen escort me out. And it wasn't anything. They didn't know who I was. I was a journalist. That's enough, right? But I think, too, in Nebraska, the night before I was driving, I couldn't find a motel, and I find this crummy, it turned out to be great. A fine establishment in which, I say this without judgment, I got in late. It was the only place I could find, and it's a broken parking lot, and I'm walking across, and there's a sex worker walking across, and there's a guy hanging out over the balcony, and he's waiting for her to arrive. And I'm okay, so great. Instead of him having to come down, I'll let her in. Please just have your night. And I'm just sort of thinking, this is the place. And I go into this place, and it is a yes and. Some motel manager has decided to spruce up his motel and had put books. It was clearly not just someone had left it, a bundle of books, and wonderful books. And I don't want to be too snobby, but they're New York Review of Books editions. I think they just bought a batch of them. My favorite novel as a child, Lizard Music, a beautiful book by the Swedish writer Tove Jansson, if you know the Moomins, The Summer Book, and The Lonely Place, a fantastic noir, one of the few noirs by a woman writer from the 40s, one of Humphrey Bogart's movies as well. And there these things were coexisting. And I think about that, like knowing the place is being alert to both of those things. There's a narrative of journalists who parachute in, and I like to say I just slide around. I can't say that I spent a huge amount of time in Nebraska. Part of that local knowledge can come from the deep lingering and the political organizing, and part of it can come and sort of seeing in a poetic way, hopefully, the kind of the sideways glance at what's happening here, the loveliness of these books and a Fleabag motel that allows you then to hear, before the pastor kicks me out, the music of his worship band, which was fabulous. It was fabulous. And that's the yes and. But again, that's a sharp yes and. Those are men with guns. It's not like, hey, let's all agree to get along. They've already made that decision. But imaginatively, I think that's the kind of knowledge of a place that we can see the loveliness in everything.
And that pastor, by the way, just hosted Charlie Kirk as they're trying to undo. We split our electoral votes in Nebraska. It's this unique thing. We gave Biden an electoral vote last time around, where the numbers and polling show that that's going to happen again. So the Republicans are trying to undo that right before the election. So it was a very radical rally at that church. The sense of place and being able to really accept the fact that folks that were organizing do have different political beliefs, especially on race, when we're organizing. So we not only organize against pipelines, and now we're transitioning to work on clean energy. It's a big project we're about to launch this summer, but we've done a lot around corporate ag, because rural folks, you would think that they support corporate ag, but they hate corporate ag because a lot of them are hanging on by a thread. Family farmers and ranchers know that corporate ag just brings more monopolies and more pollution into their communities and locks them into a market where they're not getting the best price for their products. And then a lot of them also have concerns with corporate ag means folks coming in, mostly undocumented immigrants, to their communities and what that means for their infrastructure. So on the one hand, we're organizing with folks who we have the same common value of wanting to protect family farmers and ranchers, wanting to protect our land and water. And then you have some of those same people in the coalition that are there also because they don't want undocumented immigrants moving into their community. And yet, immigrants are the only people who are breathing life into our small rural towns right now. And it's become, especially in the town that I live in, Hastings, the town next door, Grand Island, these beautiful communities that are now part of the fabric of our towns. But I always remember this one story where I walked into a living room of a group of family farmers that we were fighting Costco chicken plant. I know everybody loves Costco and they're good on their worker benefits, but don't buy their $5 rotisserie chickens. Very bad. So I go into this living room. It's a group of farmers I haven't yet organized, but they know me from my work from Keystone. We're getting ready to go to a community meeting about zoning to try to zone the chicken plant out. And we have a great meeting. We're talking about strategies. The one guy says, "Follow me into town." So I get into my minivan. I follow him in his pickup truck, and he has a "Don't Tread on Me" bumper sticker. He has the member of the Tea Party, and I vote. And then he has a sticker about the NRA, which basically has a broken pencil. And it says, if you think guns kill people, then pencils fail tests, something to that effect. And he knows what bumper stickers he has, right? So I'm following him into town. He knows that I'm a progressive Democrat. I get out of my minivan. He comes over and he said, so what'd you think about my bumper stickers? In that moment, as an organizer, you have a choice. You can start a fight about the NRA and about how the Tea Party is creating divisions in America, or you can really begin to use humor and bring back to where we're working from. So I really just put my arm around him and I said, well, we definitely don't agree on the NRA because you know that I want to see gun reform. And I said, I'll bet we don't agree on abortion rights either. So I just put that one on the table. And I said, but I will bet that there's not another Republican leader that's going to be in that room standing with all of you guys to protect your property rights and to protect the town's water. I was like, so let's start there. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to realize that as we start to organize and as we start to bring America, as we want to bring America back together again, that we have to start in certain places and on certain issues, not pretend that the other stuff doesn't exist. Like, we have to address that. And as you form relationships with people, you do begin to address that. You do start to talk about, actually, yes, you have these negative images right now of immigrants, but there's a lot of good that immigrants can bring. So that's the joy that I'm seeing in rural organizing, is that possibility.
So out of that granular knowledge, that recognition of some of the particulars and sometimes contradictions, exactly as you're saying, that I'm fascinated by the way in which you've each turned at different times to a kind of documentation and projects that are essentially portraits, profiles. And Jeff, I think I've told you, so Marianne Andre and I, we teach together at the University of Tulsa. We teach a multimedia journalism course. One of the things that we have done is have the students essentially imitate the Instagram project that you've engaged in on and off, which is essentially a kind of deep portraiture, a deep but very quick profile, exactly as you're describing. And to me, it's not parachuting in. It's about an alertness, an awareness, and a recognition that everyone we meet has some sort of a backstory, and it's never tidy, it's always complicated, but it can be distilled, and that we can capture some sense of their essence and of their complexity and find some commonality in that as well. And there's actually something transcendent in recognizing again and again that there is this kind of shared humanity in those contradictions. And Jane, you did very similar things, and often with Marianne, going and shooting portraits and profiling people who were going to be affected by the Keystone XL pipeline, and showing these are very different people. They have very different reasons for opposing the pipeline. They have different backgrounds and different concerns, but again, that there's some opportunity for a sense of commonality and perhaps even then shared purpose that arises out of this sense of the individual. So I wonder if you can each talk about those particular projects, but also just the ethic behind that, this notion of trying to build some shared narrative, but that it comes from a deep respect for the individual.
Yeah. I think some organizing campaigns could be viewed as extracting yet another thing from a community. And we were very aware of that. So we always led with the faces and the voices of those who would be most impacted, and made sure that when we were creating profile graphics of them, which Marianne brilliantly captured the farmers, the ranchers, the tribes, and the urban climate advocates as well, we would always pair their image with a quote from them, because that was very important, and always got their permission. Like, that was a very important part of our work too, that here's the graphic that we're going to use. And yes, we're going to send this to President Obama and just all these other things. We also did this interesting campaign because I was worried that most of the Keystone XL fight was in rural communities. And a lot of the people that were first initially aware of the pipeline were, of course, people who live in those communities. But we needed mass numbers, right? We needed mass numbers opposing this project in order to get the president's attention. And obviously, those folks are in the city. So we needed to create some type of visual campaign that urban people could also see themselves in. So we have this great rancher. His name is Randy Thompson, tall, looks like a rancher. And I would notice in community meetings, both rural and urban people would go up to Randy, right? He's tall, he has a commanding presence. So I started to realize, obviously, I automatically thought Randy was a leader, but other people were gravitating towards him as a leader too. So I took him out for coffee and I said, I want to create you as the face of this next phase of the Keystone XL fight. And we've already created a graphic and it's called Stand with Randy, because I want people to be able to say that they are taking a stand and they're aligning themselves with you, but you are representing everybody along the route. So I show him the graphic of it and he slides it back over to the table and I'm like, fuck. I messed this one up. And he's like, I'm not that white and I'm not that fat. I was like, okay, so we make you a little bit more tan and we make you a little bit slimmer. Will it be okay? And he was like, yes. And we talked through, but like all the complications that this is going to bring, he's now going to have all the attention on him. And he was a Republican at the time. He's now an independent, which that was also an interesting thing for me to watch, of partisan Republicans being involved in a 10-year fight. The vast majority of those folks are now independents. They know that the Republican Party was not there for them when they needed them. They will joke with me saying, we're not that far going to be a Democrat. Like, let's not get crazy. But we're now an independent where I am now critically thinking and thinking hard about who actually has my back. So I think those types of campaigns do that, not only for the people involved, but for the people who are around as well.
As I listen to that, I think, and that project, which I haven't seen and I really want to see, so you have to tell me after this where I can see all this work. But I think it occurs to me, the Venn diagram, where there is a creative work to political organizing. It's an imagining. You are more in the category of fiction, and I mean that as no insult. You are imagining an otherwise that could be. But the Venn diagram between the work that you're doing and the work that I'm doing is in the image in between these photographs and so on. And although I'm a secular Jew and not a believer, I use the term in the image deliberately to speak to however you want to imagine the divine that can be captured in another person. So I want to also throw a wrench into my own proposition of the yes and who can do that work, and the way I can stand outside a militiaman's house or church and be welcomed in, or you can follow the NRA truck. I teach a class at Dartmouth College, which is where I teach, and my essay in Switchyard is about Vermont, where I live, and particularly the most rural region and the second most rural state, called the Northeast Kingdom. And it really is called that and always has been. And aren't you jealous of a place it's actually called the Northeast Kingdom? So I taught a class around students going up there and documenting it and just being in that place, however they wanted to be. And a lot of Dartmouth students thought that about 20 minutes outside of campus, well, if they knew about Deliverance, they would have started hearing Deliverance banjos. They were so sure they were going to get in trouble. And I'm like, well, no, this place is more complicated. But sure enough, a young black woman driving up north gets pulled over for that notorious crime of lane changing on a road in Vermont. I mean, we have the highways, but it's in quotes because there's nobody on them. And white cop, black woman gives her a ticket for lane changing. That is a flattening of perception, right? We all know that. That's what a stereotype is. It's a flattening of perception. Whereas I think these images, a photograph, spending time with a person, even in a story, if you can draw not necessarily from the research that you have historically about that place, but the deep well of your own experience. And maybe where I do differ from the political organizers is I tell my writing students, I am not an altruist and I'm against altruism. I make these stories because I want to make them. And I hope other people will like them, but I'm probably going to make them anyways because I want to draw on that subjectivity. I wish that cop had drawn on his subjectivity when he saw my student. He was drawing on it in one way, but he wasn't being self-aware. He was drawing on the fear and all the narratives that had come to shape him. And he was putting it on the flat horizontal axis instead of the vertical axis of how did I come to feel broken? How did I come to feel grief? And we were talking about climate to begin with. And my essay in this book is about, among other things, climate grief, although it is barely mentioned, because I think it permeates everything, whether you believe in it or not. I think of those guys I said I was secular Jew. There's a history in Yiddish America, and here I am in Tulsa, Yiddish capital, I'm sure, which was the language of the Eastern European Jews, mostly extinct. It still exists, but at a fragment. But in the early 20th century, it was a very radical community, and there would be a Yiddish anarchist Yom Kippur ball, a feast on a holiday of fasting. Not just a feast, a pig roast. And these were all folks who were coming out of Eastern European shtetls and so on, and they knew this stuff. And I always thought of that as saying, see, God, see how much I don't believe in you. You're in that conversation. So when I see a truck in Vermont, in Nebraska, with those coal rolling pipes, I want to burn extra gas. I will spend more money to spew black smoke into the sky. See climate change, see how much I don't believe in you. See how brokenhearted I am by this betrayal of the expectation of the life I could have. So we all have that. That deep research is there. We all have that grief. We all have that fear. And we can draw on that, even if it's a portrait where we go and we meet a person for a little while, or then we linger for a little longer and we discover that, in fact, the person we were looking at was even more slender than we realized, right? And we're laughing, but we all have bodies and we can understand that. He has a body and he's thinking about, hey, this is who I am and this is how I want to be seen.
Jeff, I want to turn the conversation to this question of the difficulty that happens then when we try to lift that feeling, because it's so easy, I think, to exploit that brokenhearted feeling. It's so easy to come in politically and say, that's exactly right. You've been mistreated. You're the one in the right. And you have every reason to be not just brokenhearted, but angry, and not just defiant, but potentially violent. You're justified in all of that. And it strikes me that some of your constitutional allergy to turning toward organizing has a bit to do with your background, your story. And I wonder if you would talk a bit about that so that we can turn to talking about tactics. But share with everyone some of your background.
Well, I didn't know I had a constitutional allergy toward organizing, but now that you say it, thank you for the... No, I'm like, Dr. Genoways, yes, thank you. It is not an allergy to the act of it being done, but it's not what I do. Also because I would be sitting there and lingering on the conversation, moving in this other direction. We were talking about this yesterday in terms of climate, and I was talking about a young student of mine from Bermuda, where climate crisis is urgent. And he's going on to graduate work in paleontology because he loves dinosaurs. But he's saying, maybe I should switch my focus to climate science. And his advisors say, no, keep going with paleontology because we don't know what's going to help. We don't know. And I think that's a little bit early on. I'm not sure which part of my history leads me to... I think actually I would say, and I don't know if we've talked about this, Ted, but since I've already played the Jew card, I grew up a Jew in a very non-Jewish place. And here we are at a moment where anti-Semitism, I think, is being weaponized by the right in the way that fear of race and DEI was before that, and the way that they will always find that grief and give it another name instead of asking the person to linger in the place of mourning, right? Unprocessed grief turns violent. It curdles. When we mourn and we think about what was lost, and I was saying to Ted, because Ted called my essay in this downhearted. And I was like, Ted, that was my happy story. What are you talking about? But this issue is suffused with a sense of loss. And I think you can understand that in all sorts of ways. So growing up as a Jew in a small town and community, and there's a great essay in here by Michael Crowley about growing up Korean American in a small town that he loves, but he can't go back to because even though there was so much wonderful community there, there was also that racism. And I think that's a real loss. Crowley loves his town. I didn't really like my town that much, but it's still lost. And we see that rippling and that kind of resistance, and maybe my resistance to organizing, though, I would say, and maybe this is my question for you, Jane, about a different kind of organizing, because we were talking about that. So much, even in that phrase you used, I would say, like, bring America back together again. It can't happen. It's done. This has happened. Trump happened, right? I think about loss. When someone dies, we mourn. We don't say, hey, how will to have mom back again? You won't, right? What do we live? We've lost in climate. We've lost in democracy. we don't get to go back to that moment, which is, of course, the lie of Trumpism, make America great again, and a greatness that never was. How do we organize? That's my question for you. How do we organize acknowledging loss with the awareness, too, that probably the most maligned political speech in 20th century American presidential politics was Jimmy Carter's when he tried to speak to malaise. He tried to name the loss. And you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to tell us it's going to be okay again, and everything that you lost, you'll get back. How do you organize and say, rural Nebraska, it's not going to be the way it was? So we mourn that, but then we build something new.
I think the main thing as an organizer, the lesson that you always have to remember is that you have to meet people where they are, not where you maybe think you want to go. And you also have to be open to where you think you might want to take a community is not really where that community wants to go, right? And that you may not be right, actually. The lessons are always coming from the people who live and love the place that they call home. So right now, I deeply believe that working on energy and food are two very clear things that we can use to bring America together. Both urban and rural America need food, and we both need electricity. And the question now is, are we going to stay on the same climate organizing model, which has been to beat people over the head that you need to consume less, that you need to recycle more, and that the answer to all of our problems is 100% clean energy, which for the vast majority of Americans, they can't get their head around. And there's a lot of states, including Blue New Mexico, that are able to give all their high school students free college tuition because of the oil and gas industry. So I think as a climate movement and climate organizers, we have done a disservice to actually trying to tackle that problem with keeping it in a space where we're talking about 1.5 degrees, right? Instead of people's homes, instead of people's livelihoods, instead of water, instead of our shared air. I was just down in New Orleans with folks who are experiencing obviously massive amounts of pollution. The Homa Nation, one of their elders told me that where they used to hunt, they now have to fish because of the land disappearing from all of the pollution from the oil and gas refineries. But they also acknowledge that a lot of their kids are in the oil and gas jobs, and that's how they are continuing to be able to raise their families. So for me, it's how are we making sure that we're actually building now an energy infrastructure that is sustainable, that is actually going to build up a community, that a community can take a sense of pride in, and that is leaving a lot more money behind for folks, which the oil and gas industry did not. They're leaving us a lot of pollution.
Jane, I wanted to bring you back to the case that you alluded to with the organizing against the Costco poultry plant. This was a case, as you well know, that I wrote about for the New Republic. And it does seem to be somehow my curse. I had to leave Nebraska so that I didn't have to talk about Fremont, Nebraska anymore. A community that it seems that for a number of years was always popping up as a symbol of all of the worst and most complicated things going on in the state. And in that way seemed to be constantly producing governors and so on as well. That all of the politicians that were most reprehensible seemed to be coming from there at the same time. Shout out to Ben Sass. The thing that was fascinating about that case to me was that it was, in many ways, it was a very direct environmental threat. And yet, the thing that was mobilizing in Fremont was that there was already this political machine that existed that had emerged out of undeniably racist roots, that had been mobilized initially to try to keep people who were Hispanic workers who were at the Hormel plant on the south side of town, that now the prospect of a chicken plant, I mean, it was overtly stated, like, we don't want people who are going to be coming here to work in that plant because they're primarily Somalis, they're Black, they're Muslims, we don't want them here. And I had questions at the time about working with such people, working alongside them against a project. And I don't want to simplify your stance too much, but your argument was essentially there's a very pressing and imminent threat here with this particular project. Fremont is a racist place, and it's going to take a long time to unwind that. If we're not willing to work with these folks, then it's a racist place that also has poisoned water.
Yeah. And I think the other point of that is that unless we're willing to go into communities where we may be uncomfortable, and those folks may be uncomfortable with progressive organizers coming in. So there's both sides are feeling a sense of uncomfortableness. But that massive change happens when we are made to be uncomfortable and when we do feel loss. Folks in Fremont were feeling a loss of days gone by when they remembered their towns flourishing without big corporations. And now they see that the only way their town can exist are these big monopoly corporations coming in. And the only way that we could talk about really how racist their views were of immigrants who were going to now be the backbone of their community was to work and organize alongside them. Because the only way that they're open enough to have those conversations is if there's mutual trust that you're there also to help some of their goals, which is to stop this chicken plant. And through those conversations and through those kitchen table organizing, you then begin to say, look, what you're saying about the Muslim workers is just not true. They are not bringing machetes to cut the arms off of your children and your wives. That is not true. I don't know who told you that, but I'm telling you that they're telling you that so you fear them. And we're having those same types of conversations around clean energy right now. I'm in communities with rural folks who truly believe that China is putting sensors into solar and wind in order to monitor their every move, or that ice is going to form on wind blades and fall off and decapitate them or their cattle, or that magnetic fields are coming off of wind and solar that will cause women and cattle to have abortions. These are conspiracy theories that have been pushed to them by fossil fuel corporations that they truly believe. So we can laugh and mock at that, or we can start to organize in rural communities and be very clear that it is intentional that you are getting this information because fossil fuel corporations want to keep a monopoly on the energy market, and they don't want rural communities to thrive with clean energy. Those are the types of conversations that we have to have, but that can't happen if we stay siloed in rural, urban, suburban.
I love folklore. And conspiracy theories are a subdivision of folklore. So when we say we can laugh, or we can say, hey, that's really interesting. You think that there's these invisible waves. That's fascinating. That's your cultural folkways stoked by Shell Oil. So I almost think the laugh, or I think we can laugh and, because I think there is comedy in this. And I think the terrible risk, and I think trying to write about these places. And when I say these places, I'm not from anywhere. I mentioned that town. I'm not from that town. I am the rootless cosmopolitan. And I think many more of us are than is fully acknowledged. That's been a shaping of American life. So in fact, the appeal to, I am a little bit wary of the appeal to people in a place know what's best for that place. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it takes an outsider, and some of us have no choice but to be outsiders. And then also in that capacity to take those conspiracy theories, to take all those ideas and to acknowledge that laughter also comes a little bit from fear too. I think of my first book. I was traveling around with a friend in Hendersonville, North Carolina, and the headline of the newspaper says, "She-male intruder menaces church." This is years ago, and I'm sure that headline would be much more progressive now. A person had gone into a little family church, a black person in a white family church, and had opened fire. And thank God there were blanks in the gun and nobody was hurt, but the person was in jail. So my co-author and I went to see the local sheriff, Sheriff Thomas Breedlove, who, and I am flattening, he was every Southern sheriff I'd ever seen on TV. I'm sure he was something else, but to us, that's what he was. And we had New York license plates. We were two men. He was just operating on the assumption that we were a gay couple. So we let that ride to see where that would go. And he pulls out his drawer. It's like, this is an awkward situation. And he pulls out a gun and points it at us. And it's an absolutely authentic, fake toy gun. And he says, see now, if you had pulled that on me, I would have shot you. And that just goes to show you that things that aren't real can still hurt you. That's what he meant about the blanks in the church. That could have been said about so much and about these stories. And I think actually when we laugh at them, We laugh at the story about ice falling off a windmill. This is so outlandish. But that story is actually doing damage. It's hurting. It is not real, but it is impacting like a bullet. So we laugh and we're afraid and we understand it as part of the folklore as artists who are sort of interested in it. And we recognize that there is no pure narrative. So the intrusion, and Bill McKibben in here writes about the way the oil companies sort of stoke these stories, but that's storytelling too. And then we have to go in and, as you do so brilliantly in your community, go in and say, okay, how do I collaborate with this story? I can't just push it aside and put a new one on. How do I collaborate with it and move this story in a different direction? That's the yes and. But what if it went this way instead of that way?
It's interesting that you said sometimes towns don't know what's best for them, because there are a few instances where I do think that that's true. Two of my friends left DC. They hated working in politics. They were totally disillusioned. They moved to a small town, Wardensville, West Virginia. They took over the general store, and they're two gay guys. So, of course, they were, you're a bunch of outsiders. We don't want you here, all this kind of stuff. But they just kept on building. So they then opened up a farm and then a glass studio and now a restaurant. And they employ over 150 people in the community, more than anybody else. So now the town's not laughing at them, right? Not mocking them anymore. There's still a small group of people that were like, we want the old Wardensville back, where we didn't have all this tourism and all this activity and economic growth and future for our kids. But the vast majority of the town—
We want no future back.
Right, no future for our kids. The vast majority of the town is like, yeah, there was a new future for us that we weren't seeing, envisioning. And obviously this is being done with the community, not at the community. But sometimes, yeah, it does sometimes take an outsider.
So where I want to conclude is a question that I've asked a number of our panelists, and it's been brought up here, this question of misinformation and disinformation, this question of who's creating and who's controlling the narrative. One of the things that's a significant challenge right now, I think nationally, is that there are these huge corporations that have tremendous resources that they can commit to creating a narrative and driving a narrative. The same is true of people who are politically connected and powerful in that way. Our primary tool against this in the past was journalism. To have a large group of people who acted independently, going out, gathering information, sharing information, and informing the public, often in conversation with and in opposition to that narrative that corporations and politicians were seeking to create. That has eroded significantly in the last couple of decades.
Collapsed.
Yes, that's a more accurate word. In the face of that collapse, what do? How do we mobilize to gather that information, to disseminate that information, to inform people in a way that does allow for this narrative to be turned, to be reconstructed?
I mean, one, I'll just say, to acknowledge that there's a lot of fear and despair around this particular issue is real, because we all also see that journalism is a symbol of democracy in our country, and that without journalism and journalists, our democracy begins to start to erode. So many of our small towns had a small town paper that maybe only published 3 to 5 times a week, but was still publishing 3 to 5 times a week. And it wasn't just for news. It was also celebrating the football team and celebrating the 4-H'ers and all these other cool things that are happening in our small towns that make us so proud. And that has started to go away. Now, some of our small town papers don't exist at all, or only once a week. Thankfully, our paper in Hastings is still going strong, but I know we're not the norm. One thing that we're doing as organizers is we're creating our own news, which is not the complete answer, right? Like, I think until we figure out a new way to fund journalism like it used to be funded, I think people are trying to plug holes, right? So as organizers, we're plugging holes with webinars. For example, Bold partners a lot with a group called ruralorganizing.org. They have a webinar coming up in a couple weeks that's going to talk about white nationalism, the fear and the rise of violence, not only in rural communities, but in urban communities. They did a poll before January 6th with the NAACP across rural America, because of course, Black people live in rural communities too. It's just a public service announcement. It's not just white folks. So NAACP, Rural Organizing, do a poll. One of the questions was, what is the fear of white nationalism and violence in your community? So these are rural Americans answering this question. This is before January 6th. 60% of rural America thought that white nationalism and violence was on the rise in their communities. 40% said no, but 60%. So imagine what that would be post a January 6th narrative. So I do think that we have to acknowledge that this fear and isolation is happening, but we also have to figure out different ways of us getting news to people. So community groups are doing webinars, we're doing blogs, we're doing news clips, but that's not the full answer because we're missing the storytelling and the hard news and the accountability of elected officials, which is going essentially unanswered right now.
I said at the beginning that I don't do solutions.
Give it a shot, Jeff. What's the worst that could happen?
Oh, well, let me tell you. Because I will speak, and that's why I interceded to say collapse. And small town papers is not just small towns paper. Reno, Nevada, it's like a 4-page penny saver. That's a city. Austin, Texas barely has a paper anymore. Portland, Oregon barely has a paper anymore. Chicago barely has papers anymore. And I am all for everyday amateur photographers just taking out their phone and taking pictures. That's what I do. But when the Chicago Sun-Times says, if you want a picture with your story, you'll have to take it yourself, we're in deep trouble. And I'm going to make it worse then, because I think of this in terms, look, my second favorite book of the Bible is Lamentations. And I'll quote one of my favorite theologians, and I wish he wasn't running for president, Cornel West. I think he's making a mistake, but he's a brilliant thinker. And he says, speaking of the prophets, he says, to prophesy is not to speak of the future, it's to describe concrete evil. And when you go and you look, that's what I like about Lamentations. It's journalism. It's journalism. And you look at that, you said democracy, we're not losing democracy. And I will go a little bit further. We are in a moment where anti-democracy is fully on the table. This is not a disagreement about what democracy is. And this, by the way, is not a projection. We can go into the thinkers of the right. They are speaking explicitly in these terms. They are looking to Hungary. They are looking to Russia as models. That's not projection of cable news. That's the work that they're doing. They're saying democracy has run its course, as many in the United States did in the 1930s. And to think of a publication like Switchyard and here, and there's Woody Guthrie Museum, and I think about Franklin Roosevelt. And yesterday, I believe it was Timothy Egan talking about wandering around Oklahoma, talking to survivors of the Dust Bowl and seeing this picture of Franklin Roosevelt. So, okay, that political coalition held the day last time, but we are in that moment and the press is collapsing. And I was just sort of say, here's my solution. Subscribe to Switchyard. Really.
See, I knew you had a solution.
Yeah, really. And it's not enough, but these are these small things. Here's one. It's not they're starting to lose. I believe the statistic from one of the big journalism organizations is that a third of small town newspapers will die this year. A third. Let me just go a little bit darker. I covered Trump campaign in 16 and 20, and now here we are in 24, and our press is weaker, smaller. The white blood cells aren't there. You go to a Trump rally, publications you may not have read, Vice, HuffPo, BuzzFeed, employing thousands of young journalists going and documenting this, and they're not there. And the Times isn't there as much as they were, and they're not as good. Same with the Washington Post, which is why we are vulnerable to this idea that, oh, well, we know what this is. No, we don't. None of us know what's coming. And it's really scary and it's changing fast. Okay, so subscribe to Switchyard. Really, small publications, I think it's not enough. It's a little bit, this is the candle in the darkness, but you keep that candle going. You keep sometimes symbolic protests so that someone who has the bigger ideas, and I don't have it, comes and says, and it's probably not going to be newspapers. It's not going to be magazines. The technology has changed. I don't think it's going to be webinars either, but that's like what you do in the meantime. That's exactly. The candle in the meantime, right?
Yeah.
You hold on. And I think right now we are in the place of keeping that thread alive and not fooling ourselves and saying, oh, we'll just turn it around and we'll have newspapers again and democracy again. We lost that. We let it go. So hold on to something till we can feel our way into something more lovely that is maybe, perhaps yet to come.
I'm going to leave it there. I think that that is right, though. And I think that a candle in the darkness is certainly still better than the darkness itself. So it does feel like a bit of hope. And as you say, the idea that if you can keep that alive, that is an opportunity for somebody with the big idea, not just an individual necessarily, but an upswelling of people who are ready for something new to come along. This is where we turn it to you. You've all had that inspiration. Now go forth and save the country if you can. And thank you all for coming
Start a little
out.
magazine. Compete with this guy.
Please. And again, thank you all for coming out. Thank you so much to Jane Kleeb and to Jeff Sharlet for making the journey here to Tulsa and to being with us here today. Thanks for listening to Switchyard. I'm your host, Ted Genoways. If you liked this episode and you want to support our podcast, please share it with your friends, post about it on social media, and leave a rating and review. Switchyard is a production of the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa. We made this episode with executive producer Marianne Andre and Charles Lipper and Cass Ali at Volubility Podcasting. Special thanks to TU President Brad Carson and the Church Studio.